Thank you.
Annie, thank you so much. And I want to thank all of you for being here. I'm recognizing some familiar faces, so I'm very happy to be seeing folks on this call and want to set the stage up front that we hope this will be a dialogue and a conversation. We have a lot of questions prepared for our three speakers today, but we do hope to reserve a fair amount of time at the end for Q&A. So please feel very free to, at any point, drop your questions into the chat, which Ali and Yossi will be monitoring throughout. And then we'll also have some time at the end where you can come off mute and discuss and ask your questions live of these three speakers. So thank you, Annie. Thank you, Lenfest, for hosting this conversation. We are so glad to be partners with you in this work. And I want to start by asking Yossi just to share a few photos of the event that we'll be talking about today. So you can sort of scroll, Yossi, through this list while I give just a couple of bullet points of overview of what this event was all about and why we felt like it was something that other news organizations in other states could learn from. So very brief background. Back in May, these three organizations represented here, the Granite State News Collaborative, Concord Monitor, and the Nackey S Loeb School of Communications, all partnered to host the first New Hampshire News Philanthropy Summit, which was a convening of local news leaders and funders to just discuss the role that philanthropic support plays in ensuring that communities have access to the information that they need. So about 60 journalists, philanthropy representatives, and business leaders all gathered, thanks Yossi, for half a day in person back in May. The session involved about 7 lightning talks featuring journalists from all around the state who were either doing something innovative in their journalism or something innovative in their community funding models to create new pathways to funding local news. We saw there New Hampshire Public Radio's Daniela Ali, who helped to start the state's only New Hampshire-focused source of local news about COVID-19 that was available in Spanish when the pandemic hit, and that was delivered via WhatsApp. We also heard from the Keene Sentinel. Terry Williams, the publisher, was featured just in a photo a couple of moments ago. And they're developing a community-funded model for their health reporting at the Keene Sentinel newspaper in Keene, New Hampshire. So there were 7 lightning talks featured during this half-day event. We also had a visit from Lauren McCown, who is the Senior Vice President of Development for Report for America, and she delivered a keynote address. And the afternoon concluded with a discussion moderated by Laura among several local funders, including the New Hampshire Charitable Foundation and the New Hampshire Endowment for Health, which have both for many years been supporting a great variety of local news projects here in New Hampshire. So the goal for today is to sort of go behind the scenes of this event. And for any of you who are looking for ways to start new conversations about how to sustain local news in your community, new ways of funding and supporting this access to information that we all know is so important, we want to give a chance to hopefully learn from what these folks in New Hampshire have tried. So I want to start with a question for Melanie, if that's all right. And all of you feel free to chime in on this. But Melanie, can you talk a little bit about the inspiration for this event? Where did the idea come from?
Yeah, we had actually, it started a little bit before I actually talked to anybody about it, but when I was talking to local funders or just trying to get to know them, and we were relatively new, so there was a lot of relationship making that still had to go on and figuring out who to talk to. I kept hearing the same questions over and over again, where they could understand, they're like, yes, journalism, yes, democracy, but I don't know. One actually just said, I'm not sure how to explain this to my board. Like, we fund this very specific thing, like it's affordable housing units. We can talk about that, like, but journalism, like, how do we measure this? How do I explain it? And I kept hearing variations of that. So that was kind of ruminating in my head, like, how can we educate people, like, more than just one at a time? Like, how could we do that? And then a few months, several months ago, another local outlet had actually gotten some funding. They were going to put together a summit that ended up, turning into, instead at the time was going to be a report. And it just so happened that Laura and I, who sit on the New Hampshire Press Association board together, we were chatting about that, and we were both like, well, why couldn't we do that? And Laura's like, yeah, why couldn't we do that? And I had told her that I had heard about the collaborative in Chicago had been noodling with this idea of bringing together funders. And, so it was this sort of perfect storm of ideas. And then lo and behold, not like 2 or 3 days later, Steve calls me. He's like, hey, I got this crazy idea. What would happen if we had someone from Report for America come and talk to us? I'm like, I will do you one better. Laura and I are conspiring on maybe an event. And so that's how it started. And Laura and I, she's not in our collaborative, and we had never worked together, but we kind of all were on the same page of thinking, okay, we're all kind of in this together. We all have a good working relationship in the journalism ecosystem in New Hampshire. We all kind of know each other or know of each other. And there's kind of a real spirit of trying and wanting to work together to help each other. So, I think that's where we started. And in terms of like how it actually got off the ground, I'd say the most important thing that we did was we put a lot of thoughts into how were we going to do this. And our first stop was actually to go to folks who do fund journalism and to ask them what would be helpful, what would be useful to a funder, what are questions we need to be answering. And I will say the best advice we got was from Karen from Endowment for Health, who said, whatever you do not make it a sales pitch. No one wants to feel like they're sitting like at a timeshare conference and they can't get out of there no matter how good your sandwiches are. So that really kind of guided us. Okay, how can we put something together that's going to be useful, that is not about a sales pitch, but that can paint the picture of what happens in local journalism when there is this partnership, and how can we talk about it in a way that we're coming from a place of abundance where we are actual partners with the folks we're trying to reach and educate. But so that's how it kind of came together for us.
Thank you, Melanie. That is one thing that I recall you saying in our lead up to this discussion today, is that there was one thing that you definitely wanted this event to not be about, all three of you, and that was for it to feel like a giant fundraising pitch where news leaders are standing up and asking for support for their latest project. So that's an interesting point too, that came up in advance of the conversation. Steve, Laura, anything to add in terms of how the event came together from your perspective?
Well, it happened very quickly. And I wonder if that might be a lesson learned for others. I think had we set a date far in the future and been slowly working towards it, I'm not sure that we would have had the same kind of energy, and that we would have been able to sustain our enthusiasm for it with all of the other things that are happening every day. And so we actually only spent a few weeks putting the event together. And partly that was driven by the availability of our keynote speaker from Report for America. Steve got back to me and to Melanie and said, here are the dates that are available. And we picked one of those. And it happened to be, I think, only 3 or 4 weeks out from our maybe first conversation. And so then all of the things, all of you who've done events know, all the things you have to put together in terms of an invitation and a save the date and a location and coordinating all the details happened very quickly. But as Steve and Melanie like to remind me as a nonprofit person, that deadlines are different for journalists. And so they would say, oh, we're working on news time. And that helped me to realize that, yes, it was possible. They were doing all kinds of things in very short time compared to how long it typically takes nonprofits to get things done. So I was really lucky to have them as collaborators as well for that reason.
Looking back, and I think we took a lot of notes, especially at the very beginning. And I haven't gone back and looked at them, but I bet you they didn't change a whole lot. I think the first session or two that we met often for short periods of time, was really defining what we were trying to achieve, right? This whole notion that we didn't want it to be a sales pitch, that we wanted it to be inclusive of all of New Hampshire journalism, right? That we wanted this to be, step number one of a deeper level of engagement that was going to continue for months and years ahead. So a lot of the work after we really settled on what our objectives were so that we weren't kind of looking at it from a different perspective or wanted something different out of it, and we were on the same page. A lot of it was at that point is, are we going to get sandwiches? Who's going to speak when? How long are they going to speak? A lot of the logistics. But early on, we just oriented ourselves around the same mission. I think that was pretty key, because something like this, I think that first conversation is like we knew we wanted to do something, but I'm not sure we knew exactly what the others were thinking.
And Steve, I want to stay with you for a second on that theme of objectives. I'm glad you brought that up, because it makes sense on the one hand for an organization like Laura's, which serves many different communities and many different organizations. And Melanie, same with the statewide news collaborative, which represents many different organizations and seeks to serve just as many different communities. But Steve, you work for, you publish one newspaper. You're also the vice president of news for a small chain of locally owned newspapers across New Hampshire. What, from your perspective, would success have looked like for this event? And how does, bringing your own resources to this communal conversation, which will benefit all eventually in this kind of long-term vision you're describing, how does that make sense for your organization, and how did you define success?
I think in the business we're in, I think we have to define success by reaching more people with better content and work backward from there. So for us, whole step, not only in this event, but just as we put on our different hat in terms of pulling in philanthropy, it's really been guided by what's best for our community, what's going to give the best journalism to the communities we cover in the state in general, because that's where it has to start. Once you realize that that's really the most important thing, then you can start pulling back a little bit and saying, okay, well, how do we get there? How does this event really help that? And for this event, success, I think, is really defined as, do more people understand the story of local journalism and the challenges that we have? We're journalists, we're pretty good as a community in telling stories and packaging information. And to me, that's kind of what this is. It's a bunch of information that needs to be packaged and presented to the right people so that they understand the challenges we face, some of the opportunities out there, and how we can kind of work together to meet some of the same missions.
I think that's powerful, Steve, coming from, the leader of one of the largest, sort of groups of newspapers in the state of New Hampshire, to really be thinking about, you don't just need one newspaper or one news organization in an ecosystem to succeed. Each of them plays a role, and there's a valuable role for each of them.
Oh, absolutely. And I think one of the things that's happened in journalism, we lost so much depth, so many layers. And I think this is what I think the new journalism in New Hampshire looks like, and the collaborative has been great for this, is it's building this sense of depth, right? Where, you're not competing with news organizations the way you used to, because you want everyone to succeed, right? In their own markets, and the more journalism succeeds, the better it is for everybody else to build off these success stories.
I want to ask Melanie and Laura if you have anything to add from your perspective on what success would have looked like or did look like for this event before we move on.
Go ahead, Melanie.
No, Laura, go ahead, please.
Well, I was just going to add that from the beginning, we agreed, the three of us, that if we could strengthen relationships and partnerships now, that will help all of us and the larger community of journalism in New Hampshire confront future challenges. And so the summit was really about starting conversations, talking about what's possible by looking at what others in the state were doing, hearing from a national leader, and then convening a group of funders to talk about what gets them excited and interested in funding, and then starting to connect the dots between all of those people who presented and also people in the state who care. So the guests who came are attendees who are private philanthropists, who are grant-making funders, and who are really generous corporations in New Hampshire, they had the chance to see how the things they care about and that they're in fact probably already funding in New Hampshire could be buoyed, enhanced, supported by a stronger network of local journalists.
And I'm going to echo a little bit. I think for us, like at the start, we were hoping for the best, but kind of had modest, I think, goals at the start. So I think at one point, Laura and I were like, if we could just get 25 people there, that would really be something. And then to see that it was like 60 people. And I feel like that was such a success because it told me there is interest there. People do understand this. And if we are actually helping to make the case, which is a real case, it's not just words that we say. Like this is a true thing that we are not coming hat in hand. We got the goods, like we're doing a service that helps others meet their mission. It's our mission, it's their mission. Like we actually can be partners. And when to see so many people in the room, whether it's journalists in our collaborative, out of our collaborative, funders, all of these people come together. It made me so, and I was sick with COVID, so I was just bugging everybody via text and watching the live stream, like my life depended on it. But just to see all those people in the room, that was enough. Honestly, like I felt like that was success. And then we ended up having a lot of good stuff happen after, which was great, like cherry on the cake.
And I want to get to those outcomes in a second, but I have two questions before we do. Laura, I want to go to you and ask about how, from your perspective, you talk about the value of journalism. I come from a journalism background, Melanie, Steve as well. And I am curious for many of us in the room who are sort of bridging these divides really and starting to talk about, the basic fundamental value of local journalism in ways that resonate with everyday community members who don't have the same, maybe news junkie attitude or who don't already, support NHPR, their local newspaper. So from your perspective, what were the messages that you found resonate the most and that you tried to highlight on the day of, particularly in the discussion with the funders that came later on?
So let me start by telling you a little bit about what we do as an organization. So at the Nackey S. Loeb School of Communications, we're about 20 years old, a nonprofit. And our work in journalism sustainability, although we don't really call it that on a day-to-day basis, really begins with education. And the people that we're working with on a day-to-day basis are the people who are consuming news in New Hampshire. So our mission is to offer free classes in First Amendment topics, particularly freedom of the press and freedom of speech, to offer classes in community journalism to help individuals learn how to produce journalistic quality pieces of their own for their organizations, or to go deeper into a community to share information. And we offer classes in media literacy. And I think that by hosting events that connect our students to local journalists, by highlighting the First Amendment in New Hampshire through an annual event, which engages funders in the state, we're doing our part to kind of start doing network weaving really between journalism and the community at large. So when we talk to committed, concerned, connected individuals who really care about local news, when we hear from them, what we hear they care about is how local news deepens their understanding of what's happening, how it informs democratic, small d, information and opportunities for civic engagement. So we talk about, and I think I hear our funders talk about the importance of lifting up community conversations in order to grow and improve communities. And from our perspective, that starts with local news. So part of the work that we do is to host the Solutions Journalism Lab in New Hampshire, which creates opportunities for-profit news organizations to receive grants and contributions from foundations, individuals, and businesses. So when we talk to those funders, again, we're talking about the value of local news, the impact in the community. And I mentioned this earlier, but these organizations, individuals, businesses are already funding things they care about in the community, and local news outlets are highlighting, examining, and helping the public to understand and communicate about those important topics. For us, it hasn't been a hard sell in terms of the funding that we've sought. This effort is really looking at a larger pool of funding to support more organizations than just ours. And that's what makes it really exciting, because we're getting to expand on these conversations. And we're starting with a group of people in our own state who care deeply and want to see things better. You know, one thing that Steve said at the beginning of our work together was that we, the three of us in this event, were creating a local news environment that our state deserves. And that really stuck with me. And that has helped me as I've communicated about not just the work of the summit, but the work of my own organization. I feel like that language is really helpful, that we're creating a news environment that New Hampshire deserves. And as it turns out, that funders want.
Mm-hmm. Thanks, Laura. I want to sort of call attention to a link that I just dropped into the chat. This is a link to an event recap that folks are welcome to explore. And on that theme, Laura, there was a great quote from Katie Merrow, who was one of the local funders that joined this event and spoke toward the end of the day. She's the Vice President of Community Impact at the New Hampshire Charitable Foundation. And something that she said really stuck with me, to echo, Laura, what you're saying, which is you can, sort of skip the word journalism altogether when you're talking about this concept, the basic concept of an informed community that has access to the information that they need to improve their own lives and improve their community. That's what journalism is, I think, at its core. And of course, it includes lots of other things, but she was relaying this concept in a way that just really spoke to, I think, the needs that will resonate with a broader audience as we're all thinking about, how do we talk about the value of local news in new ways that sticks to journalism's core mission, of course. So you can check out that link. And Melanie, please.
If I could just add to that, I think too, like, even, in talking to folks, sometimes, again, they'll say, I get that, right? I get that it's civic engagement, but there's still like a little, like they need something to sink their teeth into. And I'm wholesale stealing this from Steve Leone, because he actually put the pin in it for me when I was asking this. I go, how do I make this practical? How do I make people understand there is an actual practical application of what we're doing? And what he said to me was, he's like, well, think about it. When an organization, if it's not a news organization or whoever, if they get funding for something, the first thing they do is they hire a consultant to go talk to people and interview people and have focus groups to gather information. And then once they have that information, they hire a marketing team to get it out to people, and they go to, well, we do that. We do that every day, and we're trusted. And like, that's the thing. So once I started thinking of it in the way that he had put it, it started getting me thinking. I think as journalists, it's so hard to talk about ourselves sometimes, or see the actual service that we provide, like an actual practical service that we provide. We look for data that doesn't currently exist, that a lot of people can use. We talk to lots of people all the time and gather up what they think and what do they want to know and what do they need. That is our job. That's what we do every day. And there is a very tangible connection between that and the missions of a lot of these organizations in the areas that they care about. And we care about the same things, which, so like, I feel like that too is a way of like bringing it even more, like, yeah, it does all these awesome things, plus we actually can do this practical service. This is what it looks like, which I think is also an important component of that discussion.
Thank you, Melanie.
So if I could just add one quick thing, is when we were kind of developing even just the structure of the event, like what's the order of people, we knew we wanted to end up on this, like, what can we do for the state hopeful tone, but we also knew we couldn't miss the story, which was there's been a lot of damage done to local news over the years, and to not have that would really kind of miss the reason that we're all together to begin with, is that the business model is broken down. And we got Report from America really illustrated that well in terms of the dangers of not having local news represented in your community. What happens when you don't have local reporting in your community? The things that happen to your town budget, information that can rise, the lack of civic engagement and voting. So I think that ended up being a pretty good lead up to saying, yep, we have some problems, but here's how we can solve these things. And I think one of the advantages that we have that, may not be apples to apples to some in this room, is that New Hampshire is pretty small. And it doesn't take a lot to say, all right, I want to pull people from all corners of the state. I worked in California for 10 years. I don't know if we could have done that in much, much bigger states. So you kind of have to come up with a strategy that works for, the amount of organizations we have.
Yeah, that makes a lot of sense, Steve. And there's kind of an insight in what you just described for anyone who's applying for a grant funding opportunity or starting a conversation with the funder. You illustrate the problem, tell folks why they should care. So as you're saying, Report for America help you to define what's lost when a local community loses its source of local news and information. And then you position, yourself or your solution, really, your organization or your collaborative as one response to that issue. So that makes sense as a storytelling narrative, very journalism focused, but it translates, I think, to the skills that many people in this room are probably using on a daily basis to talk with funders. And I want to ask about another solution, Steve, that I know the Concord Monitor and Newspapers of New England has been working on. And you're not the only organizations in the state, I think, to have received support from Report for America and to have a substantial number of newsroom staff now supported by that local, national kind of collaborative funding model. And I want to ask a little bit about the businesses that have been supporting the RFA positions and other support for Newspapers of New England. And I know this is a bit of a departure from the theme of today, right, which is the News Philanthropy Network focused on major donors and other foundation support. But this business, targeting the business community in New Hampshire, I know was a big goal for you in the day of the event. And you've done a lot, Steve, since then to develop those relationships with business leaders. So I wonder if you could talk a little bit about that work.
Yeah, so I think you start with the concept of, businesses and companies care about their communities as well, right? So they see the health of their employees as something that's important. You add that to what is it that they're doing locally, right? So you need to find the news, or you need to find the local companies that seem to be really invested in their communities. They sponsor baseball and softball teams. They help put on events. They're usually at the community events. That gives the understanding that they're usually organizations that care about the health of their community. And that's usually led by a very high level person, oftentimes, the CEO or the president. And that's the people I've tried to meet with, people that are decision makers, that say, yeah, I do care about these issues. I do want the community where I'm doing, or the town where I'm doing business in, to be something that is beneficial to my business and I'm proud of. So it's really tapping into that. And then you also have to tap into, while philanthropy doesn't really come with a lot of branding, I think something aligned to businesses can come with a lot of branding. So it helps them reach our audiences, which are still pretty big, fewer print papers maybe, but a whole lot more digital. How do we reach them with the branding campaign that says, all right, well, I'm aligned with this issue, and that really helps serve them, because a lot of times the businesses that we've worked with, they may not take out traditional advertising. They're not doing business in that way. And in fact, maybe they never have, right? Their clients are not necessarily in our footprint, or they just have a different business model, but they care about their community. They care about good reporting, and oftentimes you have good working relationships with them anyway, right? Based on the boards that you're on, based on the community events that you support. So this is kind of a natural transition to say, hey, why don't you support some of the reporting that?
Thanks, Steve. And that leads to a question that we actually got from a registrant in advance of today's discussion. And I just want to say, keep your questions coming in the chat. We have just about 2 more questions for the speakers, and then we'll get to the Q&A discussion part. So be thinking about those questions if you aren't already. And so we had one registrant ahead of time who asked about the process of maintaining a firewall between the newsroom and fundraising. And I think this applies, Steve, both to the kind of business leaders that you're having discussions with and other philanthropy or nonprofit leaders as well. So I'm very curious to hear, this is what the registrant said, I'm curious to hear your speakers address how to maintain integrity in journalism without diminishing the significance and importance of philanthropy. So Melanie and Steve, from your newsroom experience, would love to hear your thoughts. And then I know there is a lot of expertise in this room of how to handle this really important question. So please feel free to drop links or resources and ideas into the chat at this point too. Melanie and Steve, any thoughts on that?
I mean, I think that how we handle it is from, the very first conversations that we have. I can give you kind of a granular answer and the bigger answer. The bigger answer is, I think from our perspective at the collaborative, when we're fundraising, we sort of try to choose organizations that we know are nonpartisan, that they are, kind of middle of the road. We do a lot of vetting ahead of time. So that's one step. But then in a second step, we usually, if we are going to, we make sure that the missions align. So if it is something that they care about, that it is something that is, we find that we know is newsworthy, that our communities care about, that we're going to be working on. And then at a granular level, we're just honest in the conversations that we have with funders, and we say, this is broad strokes what we're going to be focused on. This is the topic area. We're hoping to find X number of data sets. We're hoping to write X number of stories. Here's why it's important, which is no secret, but we make it real clear in a diplomatic way that, we maintain editorial control. I think, and I've not met a funder yet that didn't understand that, and actually most of them bring it up to us, like saying, we totally understand that we would have no say. I've already explained that to my board. Like, they've had those conversations, and it's just a very honest, straightforward conversation. And where there's ever been any pushback or any kind of questions to see, like, how much can we push that envelope, I always respond with the same thing. Like, our integrity is what allows people to trust us, and once we lose that public trust, we are no longer serving the public, and they understand that, and then they sort of back off the questions. And I think that as long as we're honest and we're transparent, and we have a very clear, we know of what we're going to do. I think too, with a collaborative, you do have a built-in layer too, from between the funding, and then there's usually the collaborative as an organization, and then there's the partners. So there are additional layers, but we've never been in that situation where anyone's ever tried to tell us, what the reporting needed to be.
So it sounds like be proactive, have conversations in advance, and be clear.
Yes.
Steve, anything to add?
Yeah, same thing. Make it clear from the beginning, but then we created an editorial independence policy, and we give our funders a terms of agreement that list all of this, and what this is and what it's not. And that's at every step of the way is very clear, is that we have our editorial independence. We print that alongside who our funders are and what they're funding, both in print and on our website. So there's a lot of transparency, and this is a level of transparency that didn't exist before this type of funding. Now, that was always the expectation, like your biggest advertiser, there's always friction there. Now, that wasn't directly supporting a position, but it was money coming into a news organization. But we never had that editorial independence policy or terms of agreement or anything like that. So we've actually probably used this to become more transparent than we've ever been.
That's interesting, Steve. Thanks. And thank you both. Again, if anyone in the room has other ideas for the registrant who asked that question, please feel free to drop them into the chat. Just one more question from me, and then I'll turn it over to the room. Let's talk about outcomes. From each of you, I would love to hear what has happened since this event. And Laura, I wonder if we can start with you and then move to Melanie and Steve.
Yeah, one of the things that we said at the end of the event when we were all in the room together was that if people stepped up to support local journalism, that they would in turn gain a deeper understanding of issues and create outreach and engagement opportunities. They could solicit feedback about the needs of their community, and that together we could be working to find solutions to problems. One of the things that has happened as a result, maybe of the summit, but maybe as a result of us at the Loeb School getting better about putting ourselves out there and explaining the work that we do, is that as new Solutions Journalism Lab partners are starting up or are exploring opportunities to work with us, we're really clear about the kind of messaging that might be helpful to them in the field. And as an example, before the summit, and really it was because of the summit that I even did this, I started reaching out to people who had funded solutions journalism projects through the Solutions Journalism Lab in New Hampshire and asked them why, as funders, local news mattered. And then I shared at the summit some of what I had heard from many of the people who were there in the room. And that kind of feedback has turned into positive messaging about the role of funding local news that people that we're partnering with and others can use as they're talking to potential funders. And I'll just give you a couple highlights, but one of the things that we heard was that local news support builds audience and defends information, which I think is an interesting word, defends, that local news provides the social glue that brings communities to life. We had another funder who said to me, the future of any community depends at least in part on arming citizens with better information about the problems they face, as well as potential responses to those problems, which fits really nicely with the solutions journalism work that we've done. And one of the funders who also was a presenter that day said, local news funding is about recreating a piece of the fabric of democracy and community. These are really lofty goals, but not being afraid to say that we can do this kind of work together with the right partners, it's empowering. And I think it's been really helpful in conversations that we've had with potential funders for the work that we're doing. And you can bet that as we go into a fundraising season now to raise money for the Loeb School, we do an annual fundraiser in the fall. These are the kinds of things that I will be saying to potential funders because it's what their peers are saying to me.
Laura, thank you so much. I think that's resonating with the group. In fact, Regina just asked if you could drop a few of those into the chat. If you wouldn't mind sharing some of those phrases that stuck with you. Thank you. Melanie, outcomes from the event. What's happened since?
I mean, I will echo what Laura said. It was honestly just valuable to hear from, you know, the two local funders that we have, and we have good relationships with them, but it was interesting to hear why this was important, you know, in very specific terms, and it is something that we'll carry with us too, like when we're putting together materials and explaining it to people. I also think that for the collaborative, I think this was an opportunity to introduce ourselves to people. I think a lot of people know vaguely that there's a collaborative, but they don't exactly know what it is or kind of how it works. And this was a really good way to introduce ourselves because, and so in a very specific way, you know, some of the folks that were in the room that day, I had tried to talk to before, or, you know, tried to reach out to before and maybe had some success, maybe really didn't have any success. But afterwards, I could say, you know, here's who we are. Could we chat? And they all wanted to talk to us. They wanted to talk to us more. They wanted to learn more about, our partners and what we're doing. And there was an excitement. There was a real excitement. And I think part of that, yes, that's a pat on the back for the collaborative, but more than that, I think they saw all of us working together. I really believe this. I think part of the biggest success of this was, again, whether they're partners or whether the folks that were there were part of the collaborative or not, the folks in that room saw a group of news outlets working together to try to find a solution to this, to try to provide more. And I really think that resonated with them, with this particular group of people. I think they felt that. And I that came through in the conversations that I was able to have. And there were conversations that I don't think I would have been able to have or as quickly before the summit, before we were able to sort of present this to them.
So you're describing, Melanie, some of the outcomes were new connections with new funders or funders
Yes.
who you've been looking to make contact with. I'm sure many people in this room can resonate with that goal too. And then Laura was articulating a better, more specific sense of the messages that will resonate with funders. Steve, what about you? Briefly highlight reel of the outcomes.
Outcomes, I mean, we've had some conversations, but to me, this has always been step one, just kind of getting out of the batter's box. Looking back, I mean, this event wouldn't have happened had, we not united. I think a lot of times because of the collaborative is something that really helped pull things together in our state in a way that hadn't been done before, done all for good journalism. And I think this now allows us to pivot and say, okay, well, now how can we use that goodwill that we applied to a good series or good story and really apply it to what's this next phase look like? How do we make sure that we start to elevate all of journalism across New Hampshire? Because that's in all of our best interests, is in our state's best interest. And I think that's, to me, that's the outcome is gonna be in the months ahead, because we got to keep pushing on this. This doesn't happen unless you consistently try to make it.
Well said. And I think it's worth mentioning before we turn it over to the group for your questions that, while this particular event, this one point in time event came together quite quickly with the help of the three organizations you see here, what that doesn't represent is the years of work that we have seen in this state for creating the trust, having hard conversations across differences and across different organizations in the state to get to the point where these organizations thought to call one another, right? When they had an idea or when they were wrestling with a problem. So I want to also bring that into the room, that for your organizations too, that sort of trust building across different news organizations and involving some non-news partners like Laura's organization, that takes time. So Steve, well said. And I think that's an important point to think about, the long game, and you'll be measuring the impact in a number of months and years, not, 2 months since this has happened. All right, so I want to make sure that we save the last 15 minutes for questions. Please feel free to drop them in the chat. You can also raise your hand electronically, and we will call on you to come off mute and please share your question. Yes, it looks like we have a question from Small Biz Philly. Go ahead.
Yeah, it's kind of a generic question. I'm trying to get funding for my startup, Small Biz Philly. I guess, how can I convince an investor to write me a check to help me get the project off the ground? And if it's better to go nonprofit or for-profit for my venture.
Such a simple question in the first part, but one that I'm sure many folks in this room have thoughts on. And then the second part, for-profit or nonprofit, is more of a nuanced question, I think, that would love to hear thoughts from any of the speakers if you have a brief thought on that.
I went from one extreme to the other.
And that's also something that's a little, I think, outside the scope of this conversation, and we can certainly follow up on that in more detail offline as well if you have specific questions, but feel free to engage with it also, but just wanted to flag that also.
Sure, thanks, Yossi.
Does anyone have any?
I'm sorry, I was just going to mention one thing, which is that one of the things that we talk about when we're supporting local news outlets who are part of the Solutions Journalism Lab, and we're supporting them around their fundraising, is that we try to help journalism organizations think about how community needs are aligned with the work that they're doing, and creating that alignment for funders so that they understand, we're doing this over here. Here are the things that you're funding and care about over here. This is where they intersect, and where they intersect so very neatly so often is in the role of local news organizations, telling stories, engaging readers, listeners, viewers, and helping the community to understand what's happening. You know, one of the examples is we spoke briefly earlier about the work of the Keene Sentinel that is starting this really extraordinary and ambitious work around health reporting. But they started that work by going out and doing community listening sessions and really deeply listening to what the community needed, where the work that the Keene Sentinel has been doing and the trust that they've earned for generations meets the needs of the community. And I think that maybe there's an opportunity there for your organization to go on a listening tour and, without asking for money, ask what these organizations need, and then think about how you can help to meet those needs over time. It's not an overnight thing. And you know, it's pretty rare, I'll have to say, having done a lot of fundraising over the years, that you get a check in that very first encounter. But building that awareness and trust over time and deepening those relationships does actually lead to funding down the road. I wish you a lot of luck too. How brave to be starting up a news organization at a time when many news organizations are facing challenges. So you must have identified a real need in your community and you're filling it. And so tell your story too.
Yeah, I appreciate that.
Thank you. In the interest of time, and we have two deep questions that just came through in the chat, I want to suggest folks who have further resources for Small Biz Philly, drop them in the chat. And Laura, thank you for that. I think the message of these sorts of conversations take time. And one of the things I keep in mind is that kind of basic principle of fundraising is you give, and then you ask. So the ask is not the first thing. You give your story, you tell your story, you give an opportunity for input and feedback. You give information, you know, about what your mission is. And then after that period of relationship building comes the ask, you know, if you get to that point. So I think there's a lot of resources that can help Small Biz Philly on that. But I want to raise Delane's question, and I hope, Delane, I'm pronouncing your name correctly. Apologize if I am not. But a really good question about how you got newsrooms on board to collaborate with one another. When we've brought potential funding opportunities to newsroom editors, they pass on collaborations because they always pass because they're not having enough resources in place to lead a collaboration. So great question. And Steve, Melanie, you've been involved in the collaborative here for a long time. What are your thoughts on that?
So Melanie, why don't you answer this and I'll add at the end how we're taking advantage of it.
Okay. So I think the simple answer to the question was it's a little bit of what Laura was saying, in that it takes a long time. And sometimes it's not necessarily about, like, even if there's a funding opportunity, that the response there is correct, because it's like, if you have to have some sort of nucleus that's going to be sort of the manager of that project and be the neutral party that has everyone's interests in mind, because each of these is a business and they have their own needs, their own thing they need to do, and that's totally fine. They should. And where you sort of live, if you're the collaborative manager or director, is in the middle, in that space in the Venn diagram where it benefits them and it benefits everybody at the same time. So I mean, some of it is trust and it takes time. I do think that the argument, though, for being a part of a collaborative is that for what you put in, you are hopefully getting like 10 times back. You are getting news and information that you would not normally be able to have. And for us, like, we use our funding to pay freelancers to fill in the gaps of to fill in the reporting. So you're getting extra reporting resources. So we're able to point to things that where they can see they can benefit. I do think you have to think of it in that way, as, you know, it benefits everybody, and it also will benefit you in X, Y, and Z way. I mean, there's a much longer answer to that, but the distilling it down, those are the basic elements, but it takes time.
Yeah, and I think it's getting past that kind of, you know, hands off of what's mine competition mentality, because what you get out of it is much greater. You know, just today we were in a conversation in the newsroom talking about a pretty ambitious project. And Melanie, I haven't even told you about this yet, but it's a pretty ambitious project. And one of the things I do is where are our resources going to come from? And the collaborative was like number 2 on the list of where we're going to turn, because, you know, I know with that relationship that she's going to be really excited when I tell her about this. And it's going to be,
Steve.
you know, we're going to make it available to everybody. So we're not looking to own it to sell newspapers, because I don't think that's really how the world works anymore. We're doing it to inform people in a much better way, and we get to do it. And we get to do it with some additional help and make it way better than it would be if we went at it alone. And I think that's the thing is strength in numbers.
I think that's a great point, Steve, that over time, if you can kind of crack the code on collaboration, that it provides more benefit than what any one individual organization puts in on their own, or that they could have achieved on their own. And one of the key success factors that I want to mention from what Melanie shared is having the role of an independent project manager who's not affiliated with any one of the organizations, that can help sustain a collaboration over time. You know, if you have a short-term effort and you're seeking funding just for a small, you know, discrete journalism project, great. But what the Granite State Collaborative here has achieved is really something that I think is more ambitious in scope and seeks to be involved for a longer time. And so if that's the vision, collaborative fundraising, if those are the kinds of things that you're interested in, having a central, you know, chief cat herder, as the Center for Cooperative Media at Montclair State University calls them, is really important. And that person, you know, should be independent of any of the organizations. So we have a lot of resources on how to start a collaboration, and I will try and drop a few of those into the chat now. But I hope that was helpful, Delane, to start to answer your very, very important question. And with just a couple of minutes that we have left, there is another good question from Andrew talking about the abundance versus scarcity mentality that Melanie, you mentioned, but I'm sure Laura and Steve, you have other thoughts on as well. So how did you get beyond that kind of win-lose thinking? If one organization wins funding, that's a loss for me. Any very brief thoughts on that before we have to wrap up, unfortunately, here in just the next few minutes?
I mean, I'll just say, speaking from not a news organization, but a nonprofit that's out there soliciting gifts from funders, that one of the things that I think has helped us attract funding for our school and our mission, as well as for these solutions journalism projects, is that business leaders really respect and appreciate that there are organizations that, like them, are looking for ways to survive and thrive in changing times. And that as we talk about entrepreneurship in journalism and thinking about people who are creative and disciplined strategists, who are thinking about new ways to fund their work, but also to improve the community as they do it, I find that there's a connection there, and that it isn't so dissimilar from the other kinds of work that these organizations are doing. I know that Steve and Melanie both have received funding from businesses who really respect and appreciate the work that they're doing, and that they found new ways to do their work in changing times. And so communicating that kind of innovative spirit, I think, has helped at least to start conversations and then to grow those relationships over time by demonstrating a willingness to be different and to do their work differently.
And I think too, just in terms of like, I don't know that we're so unique in New Hampshire, but I'll say that in New Hampshire, among our funders, it is not uncommon for a funder to donate to the collaborative and also donate to other news organizations, because that they care about that. I mean, they see the value of doing that. And when I said coming from a place of abundance instead of scarcity, really, I was trying to get at that idea that I mentioned, that I think we don't recognize what the skills that we bring to the party, that, you know, that we're actually have resources that we can provide. A foundation or a business has resources they can provide, and we put that together. My gosh, look what we can do. Like, we can actually partner. We are bringing something here, you're bringing something here. Now we can partner and make this happen together, and we're all leaders in this, and we all need to find the solution together. So that's sort of where, as opposed to just simply, you know, well, we need money, and because democracy, and here you go. You know what I mean? Like we can show what we can do, and it will actually be a benefit to each other.
I think we're just scratching the surface on this. I think that's you know, the way I look at it is that, you know, the pool runs pretty deep if we can get to it, both from a business perspective and a philanthropic perspective, and those are two streams that are going to define the future of journalism. Not the only two streams, but two of them help. And we're trying to get past that surface to really get into some real money that we just have not been a part of, and just trying to figure out how to do that in a way that can actually benefit a lot of folks, not just person.
That's a big task, getting to those deeper layers of the pool, or thinking about expanding the pie for all, rather than, you know, a finite pie with slices kind of divvied up. And I think one of the things that your story here with the event that we discussed today, and just with, you know, the broader missions and work of each of your organizations, is that together you can solve more of that very ambitious question in the state of New Hampshire than any one news outlet could do alone. So all of these efforts are valuable. I know we're right at time here, so I want to ask for each just to come up with 1 or 2 words of an insight or an encouragement that you would leave for the folks in the room who maybe are coming away with ideas, questions, and thinking, you know, could something like this work in my community or in my state? So just a lightning round from Laura, Melanie, and Steve. What insight or message would you leave folks here who are departing with? Laura, can I start with you, putting you on the spot?
Sure. I mean, I'll go back to, again, the genius of Steve Leone to say that this was about building a local news environment that our state deserves. And that means vital, vibrant, funded, stable, professional, ethical news organizations. And as you just said, Leah, so much of the work that we're able to do in New Hampshire, we're able to do together. I'm grateful for the backbone of the New Hampshire Press Association, which helped initially to bring me and Melanie together, which then allowed us to bring Stephen, which then helped us to grow this effort. And we're really lucky in New Hampshire to have the kind of collaborative spirit that allows us to do this work together. And I'm so grateful and really honored to be a part of that, especially as a kind of outsider organization, in that I'm not day-to-day in a newsroom. So thank you for the opportunity to be a part of this as well.
Thank you, Laura. Melanie, 1 or 2 words.
Be willing to trust and try, because you have nothing to lose.
Thank you. Steve?
And after you do with that, my favorite expression is take the ball and run with it and just go for it. Don't wait for perfection.
That's right.
And if folks have further questions, what's the best way to get in touch with you? Please drop your contact information or preferred method in the chat. And with that, I want to turn it back over to Annie and Yossi at LenFest and ask if there's any final words to take us home. Thank you all so much.
Well, thank you so much for an amazing session. Really interesting, and so much helpful information for the folks on the call. We're glad that we recorded it because we have lots of people who want to hear it who couldn't attend today. And I think a bunch of us are going to go back and listen to it again and again. So thank you. We really appreciate you sharing your journey.
All right. Thanks, everyone.
Great.
Thank you.
Bye.